The silence was the worst part, that heavy, thick quiet that always settled over the field hospital just before all hell broke loose. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, not like back home in the Black Forest when the sun went down and the world just sighed. No, this was a waiting quiet, a hell-breath kind of quiet, and you could taste the dread in the back of your throat like metal. I was sitting on an upturned ammunition crate, my hands automatically rolling bandages, the smell of antiseptic and damp earth filling my nose. It was a smell I'd gotten used to, a weird mix of clean and rotten. We were set up in a dugout, just a hole in the ground really, with a canvas sheet strung up overhead that did nothing to keep out the damp. The mud was everywhere, a cold, clinging paste that got into your boots, your clothes, under your fingernails. I remember looking at my hands, seeing the dirt ground into the creases of my skin, and thinking about the letter I'd just finished for my mother. I told her the lies we all told, that I was fine, the food was adequate, the Russians were taking a beating, and we'd be home by Christmas. I'd even joked about the mud, said it was thicker than Oma's potato soup. But as I sat there, folding those clean white bandages, I had this cold knot in my stomach, this feeling that the letter was a last will and testament. I wondered if my mother would be able to tell, just from the handwriting, that I was scared down to my bones. That's when we heard it, a low rumble to the east, like a summer storm that's taking its time but you know it's coming for you. It was the artillery, the Stalinorgel we called them, Stalin's organs, with their screaming rockets. The other medics, a few older fellows who'd been at this since Poland, just looked at each other. No words were needed. The quiet was over. And then they came. It wasn't a trickle of wounded, not the ones and twos we could handle with a shot of morphine and a few stitches. This was a flood. A wave of broken men, stumbling, crawling, being carried by their kameraden, their uniforms caked in mud and blood. The air, which moments before had been still, was suddenly ripped apart by screaming, not just shouts of pain, but raw, animal screams that came from a place deeper than any wound. The smell changed, too. The clean scent of disinfectant was drowned out by the coppery stink of fresh blood, the gassy smell of torn intestines, and the sour odor of fear. My training, all those neat diagrams and procedures they drilled into us in Hamburg, just vanished. It was like a switch flipped in my head. There was no more thinking, only doing. My world shrank to the next patch of red, the next pair of desperate eyes. I was just a pair of hands, tearing open packets of sulfur powder, pressing down on spurting arteries with gauze that turned from white to crimson in a heartbeat, fumbling with tourniquets. The noise was a physical thing, a wall of sound that pressed in on you. The moans, the cries for mutter, the distant thud of shells, the shouted orders from the doctors. My head was swimming. I moved from one stretcher to the next, my boots slipping in the mud that was now mixed with blood, a dark, horrible paste. And then I saw him. A young soldier, couldn't have been more than 18, his face pale as chalk under the grime. He had a stomach wound, a bad one. I was trying to pack it, my hands slick with his blood when his eyes focused on me. They were wide, blue, terrified. And in that instant I didn't see a soldier of the Wehrmacht. I saw my little brother, Klaus. The same eyes, the same shape of the face. Klaus was back home, probably sitting down to supper safe. This boy was here, bleeding out in this God-forsaken mud-hole. A shock went through me, so sharp it made my hands shake. I had to stop for a second, take a breath. It was like being dunked in ice water. For that one moment, he wasn't a casualty. He was a person, a boy who loved his mother and probably had a girl waiting for him somewhere. I finished with him as gently as I could, whispering nonsense, telling him he was going to be all right, even though I knew from the look of the wound that he probably was. They carried him away, and I just stood there for a second, my hands stained red, my heart hammering in my chest. The frenzy died down eventually, or maybe I just got used to it. The flood became a stream. The worst cases had been dealt with, one way or another. The screaming had mostly subsided into low groans. The exhaustion hit me then, a deep, bone-etching weariness that was more about the soul than the body. I stepped outside the dugout, needing a moment, just a single breath of air that didn't smell of death. The battlefield was quiet again, but it was a different quiet now, a shocked, exhausted silence. The smoke hung low over the churned-up earth, and the only sounds were the pops and cracks of burning debris. And that's when I heard it, a cry, not a shout, but a desperate, pleading sound. It came from out there in the Narmansland between our lines and theirs. I strained my ears, listening over the thumping of my own heart. There it was again. And then another one, fainter. Two voices. One was calling out in German. Hilf, Sanitäter, bit. Help, medic, please. The other voice was crying out in Russian. I couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was the same. It was a sound every medic knows, the universal language of a man who is dying and doesn't want to die alone. They were in a shell crater, I figured, probably both wounded during the assault and trapped there. And I was the only one who had heard them. Everyone else was too busy, too exhausted, or just too numb to care. I stood there at the edge of our position, looking out at that torn-up landscape. It was maybe 50 meters away, but it felt like 1,000. Every inch of it was open ground, zero cover. A sniper's paradise. My stomach tightened into a cold fist. This was the choice. This was the moment they never prepare you for. My duty, according to the regulations, was clear. I was a German medic. My first responsibility was to German soldiers. The man in that crater calling for me in my own language, he was my comrade. The other one, the Russian, he was the enemy. He was the one who, an hour ago, might have been shooting at us. I could almost hear the voice of my old Hauptfeldwebel barking in my head about duty in the fatherland. But then I looked down at my hands, still crusted with the blood of that boy who looked like my brother. Was his blood worth more than the blood of the boy in the crater? Was a German life more valuable than a Russian life? My mind was racing, a storm of fear and confusion. I thought about just turning around, going back into the dugout, and pretending I hadn't heard anything. No one would blame me. It was suicide to go out there. But then I heard the Russian soldier cry out again, a sharp, agonized sound that cut through the air. And in that moment, the weight of the decision just evaporated. It wasn't about flags or countries or who was right and who was wrong. It was simpler than that, much simpler. The Russian was closer. His cry was the loudest. That was it. That was the entire reason. I grabbed my bag, checked that I had a couple of field dressings and my morphine syrettes, and I didn't look back. I just started crawling. I slid down into the mud and began to move, pulling myself forward with my elbows, my bag dragging beside me. The mud was cold and wet, seeping through my uniform. Every clod of dirt, every twig, sounded like a thunderclap in my ears. I kept my head down, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. I was a worm in the dirt, completely exposed. I could smell the cordite from the shells, the wet earth, my own sweat. It felt like it took an hour to cross those 50 meters. Finally, I reached the lip of the crater and peered over. There they were, two boys, just boys. The German was leaning against the side of the crater, his face grey, clutching his leg, which was bent at a sickening angle. The Russian was lying on his back, a dark stain spreading across his chest. He was younger than I was, with a fuzz of blonde hair on his chin. His eyes were wide with pain and fear. They both looked at me as I slid into the crater. The German's eyes lit up with relief. Sanitäter. Dank, comrade, dank. The Russian just stared, his breathing shallow and rapid. I didn't know what to do, who to treat first. The German was my countryman, but the Russian's wound looked worse. The German saw my hesitation. He looked from me to the Russian and back again. His face was pale, but his voice was surprisingly steady. Him first, he grunted, nodding toward the Russian. His lung is hit. I can wait. I was stunned. That moment, that German boy, lying in the mud with a shattered leg, was more of a man than any officer I'd ever met. I nodded and crawled over to the Russian. He flinched as I approached, a flicker of terror in his eyes. I held up my hands, showing him my Red Cross armband, trying to look as harmless as possible. I didn't know any Russian, so I just started talking to him in German, the same soothing nonsense I'd used on the boy who looked like my brother. Es ist in Ordnung. All's word gut. Ich helfe dir. It's okay. Everything will be fine. I'm here to help you. He probably didn't understand a word, but he must have understood the tone. He relaxed a little. I cut away his tunic. The wound was bad, a sucking chest wound. I fumbled in my bag for the wax paper and the field dressing, my hands trembling. I had to work fast. I got the seal over the hole, taped it down, and propped him up to help him breathe. I gave him a shot of morphine, hoping it would ease his pain. His eyes never left my face. Then I turned to the German. His leg was a mess, a compound fracture. I splinted it as best I could, gave him morphine too. The hard part was getting them out. I couldn't carry them. I'd have to drag them one at a time. I decided to take the Russian first. It was a purely practical decision. He was more critically wounded. I looped a strap from my bag under his arms and started the agonizingly slow crawl back to our lines, pulling him behind me. It was back-breaking, terrifying work. Every second I expected to feel the sharp crack of a rifle and the searing pain of a bullet, but none came. The battlefield was still holding its breath. I got the Russian to the aid station, handed him off to another medic, and without stopping, turned around and went back. My arms and shoulders were on fire, my lungs burning. The crawl back to the crater felt even longer. The German was waiting, his eyes closed, but he opened them when I slid back in. "You came back," he whispered, and there was something like awe in his voice. "Of course I came back," I grunted, grabbing the strap again. Dragging him was even harder. He was bigger. I was so tired, my muscles screaming in protest. The mud seemed to grab hold of us, refusing to let go. I just kept my head down and pulled, one elbow after the other, my face in the dirt. When we finally reached our lines, hands reached down and pulled us both to safety. I collapsed against the wall of the trench, completely spent. I couldn't move. I just sat there in the mud, my body trembling with a fatigue so profound it felt like I might never stand again. Someone handed me a canteen, and I drank, the warm, metallic-tasting water the best thing I'd ever tasted. After a while, I forced myself to get up and check on them. They'd been laid out side by side in the dugout. The Russian was unconscious, but breathing steadily. The German with the broken leg was awake. He saw me and managed a weak smile. I sat down on the ground next to his stretcher, my back against the earth wall. I didn't have any words left. I just sat there. Then the German fumbled in his tunic pocket and pulled out a crumpled packet of cigarettes. He offered me one. I took it. My hands were still shaking so badly I could barely light it. He lit his own, and we sat there in silence, smoking. It was a cheap, harsh Russian cigarette, Machoka, probably taken from a dead soldier. At that moment, it was like a taste of heaven. I looked over at the Russian boy, his chest rising and falling slowly. Then I looked at the German. He was looking at the Russian too. Our eyes met. And in that look there was everything. There was the shared terror of the crater, the relief of being alive, the unspoken understanding that down here in the mud we were all the same. There were no enemies. There were just men, broken and scared, wanting to go home. We didn't need to speak each other's language. That look said it all. We finished our cigarettes in silence. That day never left me. It was the day I stopped being a German medic and started being a medic for human beings. My duty wasn't a flag or a Führer anymore. It was to the breath in a man's lungs, whether he was praying to God or to Stalin. It was to the light in his eyes, the same light that was in my brother's eyes, the same light that was in the eyes of every mother's son out here in this hell. Everything else was just noise. Every morning, before the light was even good enough to see your own hands shake, there was a ritual. It wasn't a prayer, though it felt like one sometimes. It was the count. You'd open the kit bag, the canvas smelling of iodine and dried blood, no matter how many times you scrubbed it, and you'd lay it all out. Not much to look at, really. A few syrettes of morphine, each one a tiny metal tube that felt colder than the morning air. A stack of bandages, clean and white at the start, but they never stayed that way. Some sulfur powder, that yellow stuff we called wound sugar, with a kind of sick joke, because it was the closest thing to sweetness we could offer a man with a hole in him. And you'd count. Each number wasn't just a number. It was a life. This morphine syrette here, that's for Schmidt if he catches a piece of shrapnel. This bandage, that's for Weber if a sniper finds him. You do the math in your head, a terrible kind of arithmetic. So many men, so few chances. And as the days bled into weeks, and the front lines moved like a sick, creeping animal, the numbers got smaller. The pit in my stomach got bigger. It was a physical thing, that dread, a cold stone sitting right below my ribs. Our commander, a decent man turned hard by the losing, he finally pulled me aside one evening. The smell of wet wool and stale tobacco hung around him. He didn't look me in the eye when he said it. "From now on," he muttered, grinding his cigarette into the mud with his boot. "Our boys first. You understand? Our boys first." And I did understand. It was an order meant to preserve what was left of us, a logical military decision. But logic has a way of curdling when you're looking into the eyes of a dying boy, no matter what uniform he's wearing. The official supplies were one thing, but you started using everything. Your own belt became a tourniquet, the buckle biting into a man's thigh until the bleeding stopped. Your canteen wasn't for you anymore. It was for washing out a wound, or for tipping a few drops into the mouth of some kid who couldn't swallow anymore. I remember using my spoon, my own damn spoon, to try and feed a man named Klaus, his jaw shattered, just getting a little bit of broth past his lips. He looked at me with these grateful, animal eyes, and all I could think was, this is it. This is the great machinery of war, a man feeding another man with a spoon like a mother bird. It makes you feel ancient and helpless all at once. And then came the silence. Not the silence of peace, but the awful, heavy quiet after an attack, when the shelling stops and the real work begins. That's when you'd move among them, the wounded. They'd be scattered in the craters and the rubble, lying in the mud like broken toys. And you had to be quiet. You couldn't let them know you were making a choice. That was the worst part of it, the silent triage. Your eyes would scan them, and you're not seeing men anymore, you're seeing problems to be solved. That one's bleeding from the femoral artery, he's got minutes. That one over there, his chest is a mess, he's probably gone already, the breath rattling in him like pebbles in a can. That one's just got a leg wound, he can wait. You learn to see it all in seconds, and they see you. Their eyes follow you, full of a hope that's like a physical weight on you. I remember one sergeant, an old guy from Hamburg, Gunter. He'd been with the unit since France. He had a stomach wound, a bad one. You could smell it. He gripped my arm as I walked past, his fingers like iron. "Doc," he whispered, and his voice was cracked and dry. "Water, just a little, for God's sake." And I had to look at him, and I had to make the calculation. The morphine, the bandages, the time. It had to go to the kid next to him, a boy who'd taken some shrapnel in the shoulder, but had a real chance if I acted fast. I looked at Gunter, and I shook my head. Just a tiny movement. The hope in his eyes didn't even fade, it just shattered. It turned into a kind of hollow understanding. I pulled my arm away from his grip, and I went to the boy. I did my job. I saved the boy. But I could feel Gunter's eyes on my back the whole time. When I finally dared to look back, he was gone. Just another still shape in the mud. And the guilt, it wasn't just a feeling, it was a taste, like I'd been sucking on a copper penny, metallic and sour. It was a burn in my throat, a heat behind my eyes that wouldn't turn into tears. You just carried it. You carried it with the kit bag, another piece of weight. It was in a shelled-out village. The name doesn't matter anymore, they all blur together. The fighting had been house to house, the kind of close-quarters nightmare where you smell the enemy's sweat before you see him. We'd pushed through, and I was moving through what was left of a street, checking the wounded. I heard a low moan from behind a collapsed wall. I moved around, rifle ready, but it was just one man, a British soldier. He was young, maybe my age. He was propped up against the bricks, his face pale as chalk. He'd been hit in the leg, and he'd made a tourniquet out of his own puttee, but it wasn't enough. The blood was seeping through, dark and thick. He looked up at me, and his eyes widened. He saw the red cross on my arm, but he also saw the German uniform. He must have thought I was there to finish him. I slung my rifle and knelt down, opening my bag. I didn't say anything. What was there to say? I started working on the leg, trying to get a proper bandage on it, my hands slick with his blood. He was watching me, just breathing in ragged gasps. Then he moved his hand, slow and shaky, to his side. He fumbled with his canteen, the British kind, a flat one. He got the cap off and he held it out to me. His hand was trembling so bad the water sloshed out. I just stared at it. I stared at him. His lips were cracked and dry. He was the one bleeding out, and he was offering me his water. Maybe it was a gesture of surrender. Maybe it was just humanity, a reflex. I don't know, but I took it. My own canteen was long empty. I was parched. My throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. I put it to my lips and I drank. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the best thing I'd ever tasted. And in that moment, everything they'd told us, all the speeches about the enemy, about ideology, about the fatherland, it just evaporated. It was nonsense. It was noise. Here was a man, a kid really, who was dying, and his last conscious thought was to offer a drink to the stranger trying to patch him up. I gave him the morphine then. I used one of my precious syrettes on him. It was against orders. It was against everything. But in that moment, it was the only thing that made sense. There was no German, no Englishman, just two scared boys in a broken world, and one was trying to keep the other from hurting. That's the moment the war truly ended for me. The fighting kept going, but the war inside me, the one they'd built up in my head, it was over. After something like that, you're never the same. You start carrying ghosts. They don't weigh anything but God, you feel them. At night, when you try to sleep in some muddy hole, the faces come back. Not just the ones you lost, but the ones you saved too. Gunter, the sergeant with his shattered hope. The British boy with his canteen. The young recruit whose shoulder I patched up. My buddy Hans, who took a piece of mortar shell and died in my arms while I was telling him some stupid story about a girl I knew back home. They all visit. It's not like a nightmare, not really. It's quieter than that. They just appear. And they look at you. They don't say anything, they just look. And you have to look back. I tried to write letters, to the families. I thought if I could just explain it, maybe the weight would get lighter. I'd sit with a piece of paper, a precious bit of paper, and try to find the words. Dear Frau Schmidt, your son Friedrich was a brave man. He died quickly. But he didn't. He died screaming for his mother, and it took hours. I'd write. He spoke of home often, but the truth is we rarely spoke of home. It hurt too much. It was like picking at a wound. So you talk about the food, the weather, anything but the green fields and the faces we missed. I'd always end up tearing the letter up. What right did I have to tell them how their son died? What could I possibly say that would make it better? Nothing. There is nothing. So the ghosts stayed with me. They packed themselves into my kit bag alongside the dwindling supplies. Every life I couldn't save was another stone in that bag. By the end, it felt like I was carrying a sack of bricks on my back. And the funny thing is, when the war finally ended, when we surrendered and I dropped that bag for the last time, the weight didn't go away. It's still there. I carry it now. Not the physical weight of bandages and morphine, but the weight of all those choices, all those faces, all the moments where I had to play guard with a pair of bloody scissors and a tired heart. People talk about the war, they talk about the battles, the strategies, the great men who led us, but they don't know. I don't know what it's like to be down in the dirt, where the only thing that matters is the man next to you, and the terrible, simple arithmetic of a single canteen of water. The silence was the first thing that hit you, a thick, heavy blanket smothering the world after the god-awful, ear-splitting racket that had been going on for days. It was the kind of quiet that rings in your ears, a high-pitched whine that's almost worse than the shelling because it lets you hear everything else, and everything else was the moaning. It came from out there, in the blackness between the lines, a low, terrible chorus of men who'd been left behind when the shooting stopped. It was a sound that got inside your bones, a cold, wet misery that made your stomach clench. You try to block it out, to think of anything else home, a warm bed, your mother's cooking, but it was useless. That sound was the only real thing in the world right then. I was checking a field dressing on a kid named Klaus. Couldn't have been more than 18, his face pale as milk in the faint light from a storm lantern when the lieutenant found me. He had that look on his face, the pinched, tired look of a man carrying too much weight. Schmidt, he said, his voice rough from shouting orders. Forget it. It's a trick. The second you show yourself, some army sniper will put a bullet in your head. It's not worth the risk. I remember just staring at my hands, covered in mud and another man's blood, feeling the weight of that red cross on my armband. It was just a strip of cloth, but it felt like it was made of lead right then. Herr Lieutenant, I said, and my voice sounded strange, too calm. My oath isn't to the battle, it's to the wounded. They're out there. I can hear them. We went back and forth for a minute, his arguments all about tactics and preserving manpower, mine about. I don't know about not letting a man die alone in the mud if you can do something about it. It wasn't heroics. It was the opposite, really. It was just being so damn tired of the dying. Finally, he just shook his head, a sharp, frustrated gesture. Fine, go, but it's on your own head. No one is coming to get you if you get stuck out there. So I went. I slung my bag over my shoulder, the leather stiff with cold and damp, and I climbed up over the parapet. The feeling of leaving the trench, even for a few feet, was like stepping off the edge of the world. One moment you're surrounded by the earth, the smell of wet dirt and unwashed men, a kind of miserable safety. The next you're just exposed. The night air was cold, and it smelled of cordite and rot and something else, something metallic and sweet that I knew was blood. Every sense was screaming at me to turn back. My heart was hammering against my ribs like it wanted out. That little red cross felt like a tiny, flimsy joke against the vast, hungry darkness. I kept expecting the crack of a rifle, the sudden, hot punch of a bullet, but it didn't come. There was just the moaning, louder now, and the squelch of my boots in the mud. God, the mud. It was like walking through glue. Every step was a battle, sucking at your boots, trying to pull you down. You take a step and it felt like a mile. Your mind plays tricks on you in the dark. Every shadow became a body, every lump in the ground a dead man. I was shining my flashlight, its beam a weak, shaky little cone in all that black, just enough to see a few feet ahead. I'd call out, my voice a thin, reedy thing in the silence. "Comrade, Hyra ist ein Sanitäter." I'd listen, and sometimes there'd be a groan in response, a shift in the darkness. I found one of our boys first, a big fellow from Hamburg, curled up around a stomach wound. His uniform was soaked through. I gave him a shot of morphine, the needle feeling fragile in my thick, cold fingers, and I told him to hang on, that I'd be back for him. His eyes were wide with fear, but he nodded, gripping my arm for a second before I moved on. I kept walking, the beam of my light dancing over the churned-up earth, past a shattered tree that looked like a skeleton reaching for the sky. And then I saw them. It was behind the hulk of a burned-out American tank, a great, dark beast silhouetted against the lesser dark of the sky. At first, I thought it was one man, then I saw there were two. A German soldier and an American, leaning against the same twisted track of the tank, propped up together. They were just kids, both of them. Our boy had a leg that was a mess. The American had a nasty gash on his head, and his arm was bent all wrong. They were shivering, their breath making little clouds in the freezing air, and they were huddled together for warmth like a couple of stray pups. It was so normal, so absurdly human. Hours ago, they'd been trying to kill each other. Now they were just two boys, caught in a storm, trying to survive the night. The American looked up as my light hit them, his eyes scared. I slowly held up my hands, showing the red cross. "Sanitäter," I said, as gently as I could. "Medic." I think he understood the tone, if not the word. He just nodded, his body slumping with relief. I got to work. In the little island of light from my torch, the war just fell away. It was just me and the wounds and my bag. Your hands just take over. You don't think about the uniform, the nationality, any of it. You see torn flesh, a broken bone, a life bleeding out into the mud. I started with the American, since his head wound was bleeding pretty bad. My hands were so cold it was hard to be delicate, but I cleaned it as best I could, the iodine stinging the air. He flinched, but he didn't make a sound, just stared at me with those wide, blue eyes. I got a bandage on it, wrapping it around his head. Then I turned to his arm. It was a clean break, but it needed setting and a splint. I looked at the German boy, and I gestured to him to hold the American steady. He nodded, understanding, and put his hands on the American's shoulders. There's a shared language in moments like that, a language of pain and a shared desire for it to stop. A grimace, a groan, a look in the ice it needs no translation. When I set the bone, the American let out a sharp gasp, and the German kid muttered, "He's tut me a laid, I'm sorry," as if it was his fault. When I was done, the American was breathing hard, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cold. He looked at me, and then he started fumbling with his free hand at his breast pocket. For a second I thought he was going for a weapon, and my heart jumped into my throat. But he pulled out a small leather case. His hands were shaking so badly he could hardly open it. He finally got it open and pressed it into my hand. It was a photograph, worn soft around the edges. In the dim light from my torch, I could see a woman with kind eyes and two little girls smiling in front of a white picket fence. It was a picture of a life that felt 1,000,000 miles away. He looked at me and he said something in English. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the gesture. It was an act of pure trust. He was giving me the most precious thing he had, maybe so I would remember he was a man, not just a target. I nodded, my throat suddenly tight, and I carefully tucked the photograph back into his pocket, patting his chest. "I understand," I said in German, knowing he wouldn't understand the words, but hoping he'd understand the tone. "I have a family, too." The rest of the work was a blur of cutting away fabric, applying dressings, giving shots of morphine. When both were as stable as I could make them, the real problem began. I had to get them back. There was no way either could walk. My own strength was already fading, the adrenaline wearing off and leaving me feeling hollow and shaky. I decided to try and drag them. I found a piece of canvas, part of a torn rain cape, and I managed to roll them onto it. Then I started pulling. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. The mud fought me for every inch. I'd grab the corners of the canvas and lean into it, my boots slipping, my muscles screaming. I'd take 5 steps, then have to stop, my lungs burning, my heart pounding. I was sweating under my uniform despite the cold. I lost all sense of time, of direction. I was just a beast of burden, hauling two broken bodies through the hellish landscape. I decided to head for the American lines first. It was closer, and the American boy was in worse shape. It felt like an eternity, but finally I saw the dark, jagged line of their trench ahead. A voice called out from the darkness, sharp and nervous. I froze. I couldn't understand the words, but I knew what it was, a challenge from a sentry. I slowly stood up, my hands in the air, the red cross visible. I was terrified. One jumpy kid with a rifle could end it all right there. "Medic," I shouted, the only English word I knew that mattered. "Medic, Verwendiet." I pointed down at the two men on the canvas. There was a long silence. I could feel the rifle sight on me, a cold spot between my shoulder blades. Then a figure emerged from the trench. He was a tall, lanky soldier, his helmet silhouetted against the sky. He walked towards me slowly, his rifle held ready but not pointed directly at me. He looked at me, then down at the two wounded men. Saw the American uniform, and then he saw the German boy lying right beside him. He looked back at me, and in the faint light I saw his face. He was young, just like the rest of us, his face grimy and tired. He didn't say a word. He just looked at me for a long moment, and then he gave a single, slow nod. It wasn't a greeting. It was something deeper than that. It was a moment of pure, silent understanding between two enemies. It was respect. Then he turned and whistled softly. Two other Americans scrambled up out of the trench and came over. They gently lifted their comrade off the canvas. One of them looked at the German boy, then at me, a question in his eyes. I just nodded. "I come back for him," I said, knowing they wouldn't understand, but I gestured back towards our lines. The tall sentry nodded again. And just like that, they turned and carried their boy back to their trench, disappearing into the earth. I was left alone again with the German soldier. The walk back to our line was even worse. I was exhausted, drained. Every pull on that canvas felt like it would be my last. I just put my head down and kept moving, one agonizing step at a time. When I finally stumbled up to our trench, hands reached out and hauled me and the wounded boy over the parapet. I collapsed into the mud at the bottom, too tired to move. Someone put a canteen in my hand. The water tasted like metal and mud, but it was the best thing I'd ever tasted. The lieutenant came over. He didn't say anything. He just put a hand on my shoulder for a second, then walked away. The rest of the night was a blur. I checked on the boy from Hamburg. He was still holding on. I did what I could for the others, but my mind was elsewhere. It was out in the darkness, with that American boy and his photograph. As the sky began to lighten from black to a dirty gray, the first shots rang out. A single rifle crack, then another, then the familiar stutter of a machine gun. The truce was over. The war was back on. I leaned against the dirt wall of the trench, the cold seeping through my coat, and I closed my eyes. I didn't pray for victory. I didn't pray for my own safety. I just whispered a prayer for the men I'd left behind in no man's land, and for the ones I'd carried back. I prayed that the American boy made it home to his white picket fence. And I prayed that someday this whole damn thing would just be a story we told, a bad dream we'd all wake up from. But as the shells started to fall again, I knew the dream was far from over. You want to know what courage looks like? Let me tell you, it doesn't look like the posters. It doesn't look like some fella with a clean uniform and a determined jaw charging ahead with a flag. No, sir. Courage it's something else. It's uglier. It's quieter. It's the thing you find when there's nothing left to find. I was a medic, a Sanitäter with the Wehrmacht. My war wasn't fought with a rifle, most of the time. It was fought with bandages, with morphine, with my two hands in the dark, trying to hold a life together while everything around us was falling apart. And the courage I had to find, it wasn't for charging a machine gun nest. It was for the moment after the machine gun had done its work, when the screaming started, and I had to walk into it. I learned to wear a mask, you see. That was the first lesson. You put on this face, this calm, steady face, like you're putting on your helmet. You come upon some boy, and he'd be lying there in the mud, his guts spilled out, and he'd be crying for his mother. His eyes would be wide, white all around, just pure animal terror. And you'd kneel down, and the mud would soak through your trousers, cold and thick, and you'd smile. You'd actually smile. You'd say in this voice you had to consciously steady, "Easy now, comrade. You're going to be fine, just a scratch. We'll have you patched up and back with your unit in no time." And you'd say it while your hands were trembling so bad you'd have to press them against your legs to stop it before you reached for the bandage. You'd say it when you knew he had maybe 10 minutes left. but you promised him anyway. You had no right to promise anything, but you did. Because that promise, that lie, was the only medicine you had for that kind of fear. The smell. God, the smell. It's the first thing that hits you. It's not just cordite and smoke. It's the coppery tang of blood, thick in the air. It's the stench of opened bellies, of fear sweat, of soil that's been churned up with things that were never meant to be underground. And underneath it all, the sweet, cloying smell of death waiting its turn. You breathed through your mouth, but you could taste it on your tongue, this greasy, awful taste that stayed with you for days. And all the while you're talking calm, you're moving with a purpose you don't feel, because if you stop, if you even hesitate, the mask will crack and the screaming horror inside you will get out. The secret fear, the one I never told anyone, was that one day I would just freeze. That I'd see one too many, that the sight of all that ruined flesh, all that wasted youth, would finally be the thing that broke the lock on the door in my mind. That I'd just stand there useless, while someone died calling my name. And it almost happened. There was a day outside of some godforsaken Russian village. The name doesn't matter, they all blur together. The Ivans had hit our position with a mortar barrage. It was chaos, just hell on earth. The ground shook, and the air was full of this screaming metal, and dirt and pieces of things were raining down. I was moving from crater to crater, my bag getting lighter, my morphine syrettes almost gone. I found a boy, couldn't have been more than 18, with his leg just gone below the knee, a mess of pulp and splintered bone. I was tying a tourniquet, my fingers slick with his blood, trying to find the artery in that red ruin when I heard it, a voice I knew, weak but clear. France, France, help me. It was Carl. Carl, who I'd gone to school with. Carl, who'd shared his last cigarette with me that morning, joking about the lousy coffee. I looked over. He was maybe 20 yards away, propped against a shattered cot. His face was pale, and there was a dark, spreading stain on his tunic right over his chest. He saw me. His eyes locked onto mine. France, he said again, and he tried to smile, but it was just a grimace, and I was stuck. My hands were deep in the work of saving this other boy, this stranger. If I let go, he'd bleed out in a minute. If I went to Carl, I was trapped. I made a choice. God forgive me, I made a choice. I shouted to Carl, hold on, I'm coming, just hold on. And I turned back to the boy with the leg working faster, my heart hammering against my ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. I finished, slapped him on the shoulder, told him to wait for the stretcher bearers, and I scrambled through the mud, my boots sucking in the muck, my breath catching in my throat. By the time I got to Carl, it was too late. His eyes were open, staring at the grey sky, but there was nothing behind them. Just nothing. The stain on his tunic had stopped spreading. I knelt beside him and I put my hand on his cheek. It was still warm, and something in me just broke. It wasn't a quiet breaking. It was a scream. A raw, silent scream that started in my gut and tore through me. I looked at his face, at the boy I'd chased frogs within the creek behind our houses, and I felt this anger. Not a soldier's anger, not a clean hate for the enemy. This was a black, screaming rage at everything. At the war for taking this good, stupid kid and turning him into a cold piece of meat. At the commanders in their warm tents, moving us around a map like we were toy soldiers. At God for letting it happen. At the whole rotten, stupid world. My hands were covered in blood, Carl's and the other boy's, and I looked at my medical bag lying in the mud. And I had this thought, so clear and so tempting, just throw it down. Just kick it into the crater. Just walk away. Walk south, away from the noise, and keep walking until I found a place where the earth wasn't poisoned and the air didn't taste of death. The temptation was a physical thing, a weight pulling me to my feet. I was so close. I was so tired. My soul felt thin, worn out, like an old shirt that's been washed too many times. But I didn't run. And it wasn't some grand moment of heroism that stopped me. It was a small thing, a dying man's hand. As I was staring at my bag, ready to give it all up, I heard a groan from a few feet away. Another soldier, one I'd missed. He had a chest wound, sucking and bubbling, and he was fading fast. I crawled over to him, more out of habit than anything else. There was nothing I could do for him, not really. But as I fumbled for a bandage, just to make him comfortable, his hand came up. It was cold and trembling. He found my wrist, and his fingers closed around it, not with force, but with a kind of desperate gratitude. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, and his eyes, cloudy with pain, held mine for a second. Then his hand went limp. That touch, that simple human contact, it was an anchor. It pulled me out of the storm in my head and back into my body, back into the mud and the blood and the job that needed doing. It was a reminder. I was still here. I still had a purpose. Later, when the firing had died down and the immediate chaos was over, I found a quiet corner in a half-destroyed barn that we were using as a dressing station. The air was thick with the sounds of suffering, low moans and ragged breathing. And I did the one thing that always gave my mind a place to rest. I cleaned my instruments. My scissors, my forceps, my needle driver. I laid them out on a relatively clean rag, and I wiped away the blood and the grime. It was a mindless, repetitive task. You scrub, you wipe, you check the hinges. There's no thought to it. It's just motion. And in that motion, my thoughts could finally stop screaming and just drift. The simple ritual of it, the care for these tools that were the only thing standing between a man and the grave, it calmed me. It was something I could control in a world where I controlled nothing. It was a small island of order in an ocean of madness. And then, as I was repacking my bag, I found it. A letter, folded and tucked into a side pocket. It was from one of the boys I'd treated earlier, the one with the leg. He'd asked me to mail it for him if I could. It was addressed to a girl, a sweetheart back in Hamburg. The envelope was smudged with a bloody fingerprint. I held it in my hand, this simple piece of paper. It felt heavy. It was a duty, a small, specific duty. It wasn't about winning the war or some grand ideology. It was about a boy and a girl. It was a thread connecting this nightmare back to the world of normal things, of love and home. I promised him I would, and now, holding it, I had a reason to move forward. Not a grand reason, but a real one. I had to survive, if only to mail this letter. That's how it was. You found your reasons in the small things, because the big ones had all been burned away. That's when I started to understand a different kind of strength. I realized that courage wasn't the absence of fear. I was terrified every single day. The fear was a constant companion, a cold stone in my belly. Courage was the decision to tie your bootlaces in the morning, knowing what the day would bring. It was the act of kneeling down next to another broken body, even though your every instinct was telling you to run. It was a choice you made, again and again and again, until it became a habit. And I learned to draw strength from the men I treated. Their resilience was a fire I could warm my hands by. I'd see a man with wounds that would make you sick, and he'd be clinging to life with a sheer, stubborn will that left you in awe. He'd be whispering about his mother's cooking, or his father's farm, or his daughter he'd never seen. They weren't thinking about the fatherland. They were thinking about home. That will to live, that pure, uncomplicated desire to see another sunrise, it was contagious. It fueled my own. My job, in the end, wasn't to be a hero. It was to be a presence. A calm spot in the middle of the storm. The men, when they were hurt and scared, they didn't need a soldier, they needed a medic. They needed someone whose voice was steady, whose hands didn't shake, even if it was all a performance. And over time, the performance became real. I grew into the role. The mask became my face. You learn to carry the weight. The memories of the ones you lost, they become a part of you like scars. You learn to live with them. You never forget the sound of a particular voice or the look in a particular pair of eyes. But you learn that your strength isn't about being unbreakable. It's about learning how to mend yourself each time you break and going back to work. That's the anatomy of a soldier's courage. It's not pretty. It's made of mud and blood and lies told to comfort dying boys and the touch of a cold hand on your wrist in the middle of hell. It's the most human thing in the world. The last days. They weren't days at all, just a smear of grey and brown and red, a blur of exhaustion so deep it felt like you were walking underwater. The front had collapsed. The word itself didn't mean anything anymore. There was no front, no rear, just a swirling chaos of retreat and panic. Orders would come through, some young lieutenant's voice cracking over the radio, talking about fallback lines and defensive positions that had ceased to exist hours ago. And we'd just look at each other, my buddies and I, with these hollow eyes, because what were we supposed to do? The world we knew, the one with rules and chains of command, that world was ending right in front of us. Our field hospital, which had started as a collection of tents near a quiet stretch of woods, became something else entirely. It wasn't just for soldiers anymore. It was a refuge, a last stop for anyone bleeding. We had deserters stumbling in, their uniforms caked in mud, their eyes wild with a fear I understood completely, the fear of being the last man to die for a cause that was already lost. We had civilians, Old men and women who had waited too long to flee their villages, kids who'd gotten separated from their parents in the madness, all of them mixed in with the wounded from both sides. There was no us and them on those stretchers. There was just a boy with a belly wound, crying for his mother, and it didn't matter if the words were German or Russian or Polish. The blood smelled the same. The fear smelled the same. You'd move from one patient to the next on autopilot, your hands doing the work while your mind was just gone. The fog never lifted. You'd snatch a few minutes of sleep curled up next to a supply crate, the taste of stale bread and cold ersatz coffee still in your mouth, and you'd wake up not knowing if it was morning or night, just knowing that there was another bandage to change, another tourniquet to tighten, another shot of morphine to give, the last of our supplies dwindling away to almost nothing. Your fingers would get so cold you could barely feel the scissors, and you'd have to warm them under your armpits for a second before you could cut away the shredded fabric of a uniform, and all the while you'd hear this low moan, this chorus of pain that was the soundtrack of those final days. You learned to see a man's soul leaving his body. It wasn't dramatic, not like in the movies. It was just a quiet sigh, a relaxation of the muscles, and then the eyes. The eyes would go from seeing something terrible right in front of them to seeing nothing at all. And you just close those eyes with your thumb, whisper a quick prayer if you had any faith left, and move on to the next one. There was no time for grief. Grief was a luxury we couldn't afford. Then one morning the shooting stopped. It didn't taper off. It just stopped. And the silence that fell over everything was more deafening, more terrifying than the constant thunder of the artillery had been. Your ears would ring with the absence of noise. You decatch yourself holding your breath, waiting for it to start again, for the world to make sense in the only way it had made sense for years. But it didn't start. Someone came running through the camp, his face pale but his eyes bright with a strange kind of hope, saying it was over, that we'd surrendered. There was no cheering, no celebration, just a profound, bone-deep exhaustion that finally felt like it was allowed to settle. I looked down at my rifle, leaning against the tent pole where it had been for days, untouched. I hadn't fired it in weeks. What was the point? I picked it up, feeling the cold weight of the steel, and then I laid it down on the ground. But my medical bag, that worn leather satchel that was stained with every kind of fluid a human body can produce, that I kept. I slung it over my shoulder. That was my war, right there. The rifle was just a piece of metal I'd been issued. The bag was me. That night, for the first time in I can't remember how long, I slept a full night. No one shook me awake for a crisis. No shells screamed overhead. But it wasn't a peaceful sleep. It was haunted, not by nightmares of explosions or charging enemies, but by faces. The faces of the men I'd treated. The young kid from Hamburg with the sunny disposition who bled out from a tiny piece of shrapnel that nicked an artery we couldn't find. The old Russian sergeant who gripped my hand so hard I thought my fingers would break, his eyes locked on mine until the very end, a strange understanding passing between us. The American flyer whose leg was a mess, who kept showing me a creased photograph of a girl back in Ohio, telling me about her as I worked, creating a bubble of normalcy around us while hell raged outside. Their faces were clearer to me in that sleep than the faces of my own family. They were my family now. The family I never wanted. A day or two later they arrived. The liberators, the Americans. We saw their jeeps rolling up, the soldiers perched on them looking young and lean and victorious. They scanned our camp with hard, cautious eyes. We were the defeated. We stood there waiting. For what I didn't know, anger, retribution. I saw some of the younger boys in our unit trembling, and I couldn't blame them. But then one of their medics, a lanky fellow with a Red Cross armband just like mine, though his was a brighter white, broke from the group. He walked right up to me. He didn't say a word. He just looked at my bag, at the dried blood on my uniform sleeves, at the exhaustion that I'm sure was etched as deeply on my face as it was on his. And he nodded. Just a simple, slow nod. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a pack of Lucky Strikes, and offered me one. I took it. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold it steady for him to light. We stood there smoking in silence, two medics who had been trying to patch up the holes the world was tearing in young men's bodies. There was nothing to say. We had both seen the same hell, smelled the same smells, felt the same despair when our supplies ran out and our skills weren't enough. That cigarette, it tasted like America. It tasted rich and clean and foreign, and it was the best thing I'd ever tasted. In that moment, we weren't enemies. We were just two tired men who had seen too much. That bond, that wordless understanding, it was stronger than any flag or any ideology. It was a bond of mud and blood and shared humanity. When it was time to go, to start the long trek home, I packed my bag. It was almost empty now. A few rolls of gauze, a half-empty bottle of disinfectant that smelled like hope, my scissors, a couple of syringes. But it felt heavier than it ever had, heavy with all the memories it carried. The long journey was a strange, dreamlike affair. We walked, we hitched rides on carts, we were processed through camps where they asked us questions. And everywhere I went, people would ask the same thing. Not about the battles, not about the glory. They'd ask, "How many did you save?" It was the question I dreaded, because how could I answer that? The number I carried in my head wasn't the number I saved. It was the number I lost. I'd see their faces, the ones I couldn't fix, the ones who slipped away while I was holding their hand. I'd remember their names if they were conscious enough to tell me. Hans, Peter, James, Friedrich, so many Friedrichs. And for everyone I lost, there was another who made it, who walked out of that tent on his own 2 feet, or was carried out on a stretcher to a proper hospital. But the ledger in my soul was always in the red, so I'd just shrug when people asked. I'd mumble something like, "I did my job," and change the subject. There's no answer that feels right. You can't put a number on a life. You can't quantify the moment a boy stops being afraid because you've given him a shot of morphine and told him he's going to be okay, even if you know he is. That's not a number. That's a weight you carry forever. As I finally walked away from it all, leaving the uniforms and the bureaucracy behind, my thoughts weren't about the fatherland or the Führer or any of the grand words they used to get us to sign up. All of that was ashes. My thought was simpler, more basic. I had tried. In the middle of all that madness, that industrialized killing, I had tried to be a man. Not a hero, not a patriot, just a man. A man who saw another human being suffering and reached out a hand. Sometimes that hand had a bandage in it, sometimes it had a cigarette, sometimes it was just there to be held. That was the only victory that mattered. The war took so much from all of our youth, our innocence, our friends, but it couldn't take that choice. It couldn't take my last bandage. And as I put one foot in front of the other on that road leading home, the weight of the bag on my shoulder was a reminder not of the war, but of the one thing the war couldn't destroy.